Welcome to a special edition of the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me today is my good friend from Memphis, Tennessee, Curt Fields. Curt and I are working on a book project, putting into print the story that Curt tells as Ulysses S. Grant for the Emerging Civil War series. And so we're bringing you behind the scenes of that work. And Grant is going to appear to us from his tent today, Curt portraying Grant, and to tell us a little bit about events leading up to and including Vicksburg. So with that, Curt will be speaking as Grant, and I'd like to welcome General Grant to our podcast today.
General Thank you, Mr. Mackowski. It's good to be with you yet again and reflect about what has happened so far in the war. It's after Shiloh now, the Armageddon that Shiloh was, the bloodbath that it was. And there are calls for my head, the who's responsible for this attitude, and to sack me and replace me in command. President Lincoln did not. I think President Lincoln saw that the horrendous casualties, 23,746 killed and wounded, actually nearly 4,000 dead on the field, not to mention the ones that died soon after the battle from wounds. I think President Lincoln understood that those large numbers of missing, killed, and wounded were resultant not from poor command, but from the large numbers involved. There were more than 100,000 men, well over 100,000 men who fought. So he did send General-in-Chief Halleck, or Major General Halleck, he wasn't General-in-Chief at the time, to Pittsburgh Landing to personally take command. Now here is where there is something of for me, a seismic rumble, because I find myself yet again somehow shuffled, I think perhaps would be a good descriptor for it. Halleck immediately reorganized the army into four groups, and he put George Thomas, who got there after the battle, in command of one, and Buell's in command of one. He made me the commander of the reserve of those four divisions. So I really, even though I'm still the general in command of the Army of the Tennessee essentially does not exist anymore. And I have essentially no command. And that greatly chaffed upon me. Halleck begins to move south the 20 miles to Corinth, Mississippi, because one must ever keep in mind the whole idea, the driving force to fight the Battle of Shiloh was that 16 square feet of railroad crossing in Corinth, Mississippi, the Mobile and Ohio, and the Memphis and Charleston. And we still had to take that. So Halleck begins what would have to be described as a glacial move. It took him the whole month of May. Every few miles when the army moved, we would completely entrench for the night, then clear all that up the next morning and move a few more miles. It took a month to get to Corinth. When we got to Corinth, my pioneers came to me and they told me, General, they're evacuating Corinth. Well, how do you know? Well, many of them had been railroad men. And they said, you can put your ear to the rail and hear those trains and tell if they're coming or going, and you can tell if they're loaded or empty. And what they're doing, even though every time one comes back into Corinth, the bands are playing and there's cheering and hallooing, those trains coming back into Corinth are empty. When they're leaving Corinth, they're full. They're evacuating, General. I tried to tell Halleck this and was rebuffed. He'd hear none of it. He had elaborate works that would have taken 100,000 men to have manned. But on one particular foray that we made close to the lines to inspect, I was looking at what was the rebel left, the far left of their line and our right. And as a group of officers there, all of us were riding with General Halleck, I pointed out and I said, there's the weakest spot. We can hit them there. And General Halleck turned to me and said, General Grant, when I want your opinion, I'll ask for it. Well, after that, I had no inclination to give General Halleck my opinion of anything. I'd like to have given him my opinion of him, but that would not have been appropriate. And as it turned out, he had telegraphed Washington that the greatest battle ever fought is about to be fought tomorrow at Corinth. And then when we went in, we found an empty town and Quaker guns pointed at us. So Corinth fell. We did have the crossroads of the M&O, Mobile and Ohio, and the Memphis and Charleston, but they were gone. Then we went into something akin to garrison duty, and I was going to resign. And Sherman heard about this, and he came to my tent, and I was packing my trunk. And Sherman said, well, I can't repeat what Sherman said, but essentially he demanded of me through a barrage of profanity, what are you doing? And I said, I'm resigning. I'm going home. He said, don't do that. You won't be home a day before you regret that action. And when you see what is happening in the war, you will regret daily that you're not a part of it. Then he came up with what I thought a brilliant suggestion. He said, move your headquarters to Memphis. Well, that was a view of the question I hadn't taken. And I said, how do you mean? He said, you're still the commander of the Army of the Tennessee, are you not? And I said, yes. And on paper, in reality, I don't have an army. And he said, ask Halleck if you can move your headquarters to Memphis. And I said, I'll do that. I went to see the general and asked him, and his demeanor was, yes, go wherever you want to. I had written Julia a letter and said, I feel absolutely useless. I could be in the farthest reaches of my command and do as much good as I'm doing here in the center of the camp. So I moved my headquarters to Memphis, Tennessee, some 70 miles to the northwest, and was very nearly captured in Memphis. But that's a story between myself and Red Jackson that I should like to share with you at another time. But I came within a cat's whisker of being captured in Collierville, Tennessee. But another time. I returned my headquarters there to Memphis and was there until July, I think it was the 11th or 12th. And I got a telegram from General Halleck to return immediately to Corinth, Mississippi. I was going to have had to be there. And I asked him, well, I telegraphed back, and what do I need to bring? Do I need to bring staff? Why am I coming back? And he said, you may bring whom you wish, but come back. And all right. So I got my headquarters staff and went back to Corinth and got there on the 15th of July. And Halleck had little to say or do with me the next couple of days. The 17th, he left and went to Washington City. He still had not told me he had been named General-in-Chief. He did not deign to tell me. That's why I was back in Corinth. And I found myself, him gone, me there, and I'm back in command of the Army of the Tennessee, which we reorganized and got it back like it should have been. On October the 25th, I'm put in command of the Mississippi District Division, and involved in that is Vicksburg, Mississippi, and it's going to be my goal to take Vicksburg. Now, my initial plan was to go down the Mississippi Central Railroad, which goes into Jackson, Mississippi, wheel to the west, and go to the west at 50 miles or so, and take Vicksburg, take it from the north on the land. And in those efforts, I also had Sherman. He was going to leave Memphis in late December, go down and to the Chickasaw Bluffs just north of Vicksburg and take Vicksburg there, while I'm going from the Oxford, Mississippi area close to Holly Springs, where I'm having a supply depot. And as I move to the west to Grenada, Mississippi, where Pemberton is, who's now in command of the Confederates in the area, I'm going to hold Pemberton in place while Sherman comes down the river and goes in immediately north of Vicksburg and takes Vicksburg. Well, as things are wont to do, they didn't work out just exactly like that. On December the 19th, Bedford Forrest, if you'll recall, I mentioned him at Donelson, and then I mentioned him again at Shiloh, and now here he is yet again. And Braxton Bragg, who's wanting to take the war back into Ohio, has sent Forrest from Clifton, Tennessee, on the Tennessee River into West Tennessee on a raid. So December the 19th, Forrest tears up 60 miles, as I recall, of track of the Mobile and Ohio, because the Mississippi Central runs to the west of the Mobile and Ohio. They come together in Jackson, Tennessee. And then the M&O runs up into Columbus, Kentucky. And Forrest tore up all the track, tore up all the telegraph wires. So I have no way to get troops and supplies into Holly Springs and Oxford area to get on the Mississippi Central Railroad. I've got no supplies. I have no campaign anymore. And I have to move back into Tennessee. I came back a few miles into Grand Junction in Middleton, Tennessee, just north of the Tennessee-Mississippi state line, and moved back to the west into Memphis. Sherman is in Chickasaw Bluffs, and on, I think, December the 29th, he doesn't know that I'm not coming. I'm not going to be able to engage Pemberton. He doesn't know Pemberton has now fallen back into Vicksburg, and he's meeting a stronger force than he anticipated, and he's pretty much knee-deep, waist-deep in swamplands here at Chickasaw Bayou, and it was a turkey shoot for the Confederates. Sherman held out a day or two, and then he moved back to Memphis, and we came together back in Memphis to talk about what we're going to do. Well, thereupon, I began a series of 7 different attempts to get into Vicksburg. And I will not go into all of them, because trying to name all of them is like trying to name the 7 dwarfs in the fairy tale. You never name all of them at one time. But we tried canals, 2 different canals, and the Yazoo expedition blew up levees, flooded north central Mississippi, gunboats going down small rivers that became creeks and got jammed in very narrow creeks, nearly lost the Navy. In fact, they were jammed up in the waters near Greenwood, Mississippi, that David Porter had already ordered the boats to be dynamited rather than fall into the hands of the Confederates. But Sherman was able to get him out of that. The Steel Bayou, the Chickasaw Bayou, the Williams Canal, the Grant Canal, on and on ad nauseum. Now, and then Providence, Louisiana, the Duckport Canal, just on and on. I never really expected any of those efforts to be of any success. I was prepared to act on any of them that were a success. But my primary drive with them was, I had on the west bank of the Mississippi, Arkansas, Louisiana, down into Louisiana primarily, I had about 70,000 soldiers. And it's winter, and they've got nothing to do unless I keep them busy. Now, the 2 driving reasons for me keeping them busy were, 1, a soldier that has nothing to do and all day to do it is going to manufacture something to do. And it is not going to be to the benefit of the cause. The other reason was, the more compelling, I think, was that the Northern journalists they're not kind to the national efforts in the war. And if they were in the area of the Army and they see that I've got tens of thousands of soldiers that are doing nothing, they're going to be writing back in those papers back home, Grant wasting time, Army going to naught, the cause is dying on the vine, and so forth. And there's no telling what all would have been written. So they had to see something going on. So I was getting dual benefit by keeping these soldiers busy, perhaps a third if any of them had worked. I keep them busy. I don't have discipline problems. I keep the papers happy. I don't have image problems, and the cause is going forth. Ultimately, what worked was what I had thought from the beginning was going to work: to march the army down the west side, Arkansas and into Louisiana, run the batteries at Vicksburg, transport the troops from the Louisiana side to the Mississippi side, and attack Pemberton from the south in Mississippi. And the bugaboo there was running the batteries at Vicksburg. They had over some 2 miles or so. There was, I understand, 200 guns on the river. Jefferson Davis is touting it as Gibraltar of the South and so forth. And it was a terror to think of running the batteries. But David Porter, true to who David Porter in the United States Navy, and both of their attitudes, singly and collectively, Porter said, "I'll do it." And on the night of April the 16th, he ran the batteries at Vicksburg. Now, I watched this. I was south of Vicksburg on a tugboat out in the water at a safe distance. I think the Magnolia boat. I was there. My children were there. Julia was there. Charles Dana was there. McClernand was there. And we were watching Porter run the batteries. It did not go well because what had been a cloudy evening, clouds cleared up. The rebels knew we were coming. They fired bonfires on both sides of the river that illuminated the boats, some 10 boats altogether, 7 ironclads and 3 transports, all towing barges, and barges lashed to their starboard, the right side. Admiral Porter told me, "General, the right side to starboard side." And when the rebels opened fire, and Charles Dana said he counted, and he said there were more than 500 rounds fired at the convoy running the batteries. I didn't keep up with it. I was just watching it with great interest. But Porter made a brilliant move. When the rebels opened fire on him, he slid over to his left, his port, and snugged up as close as possible to the east bank of the river, which in essence made it where the rebels couldn't depress their guns low enough to fire directly on him. And we lost one boat. The Charles Calhoun was a boat that caught fire and it burned the waterline, but it was the only casualty that we had. I think there were some men wounded. I don't recall anyone being killed. So Porter had run the batteries. Then on the 22nd, a week later, he did it again because we found out that the supplies that he had were not adequate for what we needed. Now, what we needed, other than the ironclads who burn a ton of coal per hour, and there aren't any coal mines in Mississippi or Louisiana, so they had to bring their coal with them. But I announced my plan that I was going to cross the Mississippi to the Mississippi side, the east side. And in so doing, I was going to be cutting off my communication. I was going to have no supply base, at least initially, no supply line. It was the most daring move anyone had ever thought about militarily. Well, on April 30th and May 1st, Admiral Porter, once again in the United States Navy, in about 12 hours, he ferried across, as I recall, between 12 and 15,000 federal troops. Got a whole army across the river. And the most remarkable of that, there are 2 factors. The most remarkable being it was the largest amphibious operation in history. And if I may slip time a bit, it was the largest amphibious operation until D-Day. in 1944, and that was 1 million men involved. The other factor, and not a shot was fired. Not a shot was fired. I didn't lose a man, didn't lose an animal, because on the 17th of April, now we ran the batteries on the 16th. On the 17th of April, I had sent Benjamin Grierson, Colonel Grierson, and about 1,700 troopers, a couple of batteries, light artillery, out of LaGrange, Tennessee, which is due east of Memphis, Tennessee, about 40 miles or so. And Grierson's charge was to go down the east side of Mississippi, do as much damage as you can, wreak as much havoc as you can, and move as fast as you can, and get back if you can. So it was, some contemplated it as a suicide mission, but Grierson led those troopers out on the morning of April 17th, and 16 days later, they staggered into Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And about halfway through, he had sent about half those troops back, but he burned plantations, he burned railroad stations, he tore up track. He kept moving, though, and Pemberton on the west side of Mississippi in Vicksburg is sending almost all his cavalry to the east side of the state. So his eyes are not on me, on the Mississippi. His eyes are all on the other side of the state. And much of his infantry was over there. And Grierson is moving so fast and hitting so hard in so many different places that Pemberton didn't know if he was coming or going. So when I crossed the river, there's no Confederate resistance, even though Pemberton knew I was there. But his attitude was, bah, Grant won't do that. He can't do that. He won't do that. Well, he was wrong. My agenda was different from his. And I got, as I have said, I found myself on the same side of the river as the enemy, on dry land. And I was exultant. Now, over the next 3 days, I moved all of my troops across. I think the last division coming across was, I think McClernand was the last one across. But I had McClernand, McPherson, and Sherman, some 35,000 or so men. Now, the two issues, parallel issues from both sides that I'd like to point out, one being Joe Johnston, the other being Sherman. When I put out the orders, I gave Sherman the orders. I keep my orders in my breast pocket until it's time for them to be carried out. I have found that to work best, because one never knows how these things get out, but they don't get out because they don't get out of my pocket. But Sherman got his orders about what I have just outlined to you, Mr. Mackowski. He came calling, and we found me and my staff on a piazza at a home where I had my headquarters, and he patiently waited, and I saw he was waiting to see me. So I dismissed the fellows, and we went back in our office and closed. Sherman closed the door, and he said, "Grant, you're a damn fool." And I said, well, of course, that didn't particularly surprise me from Sherman, but I said, how was that? And he said, this madness that you're planning, this idiocy that you're planning, you're cutting off your supply line. You're out of supplies. You're out of communication. The rebels outnumber you 2-1, and they did. That's when I get to Johnston, Joe Johnston. He said, I'll have none of this, and wrote me a letter, gave me a letter he'd written disavowing anything to do with the plan that I was going to. He said, you're putting yourself in a position that the rebels would have maneuvered you for a year to get you into where you're going to put yourself. It's madness, Grant. And I said, well, so is your opinion. Then he gives me the letter. He said, send this to the War Department. I want them to know I have nothing to do with this. Now, I'll do what you tell me to do and carry out my orders to the spirit, not just the letter. But I think this is madness and you're a damn fool. I took his letter, and after some little conversation, he took his leave. Now, when others found out about this, I was queried about, what are you going to do about that? Does that not disturb you? Not at all. Not at all. Did not then, does not now. I know Comp Sherman. He's a soldier. He's a professional. And I viewed our conversation and the letter that he had written as merely a friend talking to a friend and expressing his concerns. And I will have to say now, as I reflect back on the matter, and we are in possession of Vicksburg, that Sherman, in fact, I'm writing in my final report of the campaign that General Sherman performed admirably and, in fact, carried out his orders as enthusiastically as if he was the originator of the plan and they were his orders. Comp did well. Now, I'll jump ahead a bit and tell you, when we were pushing Pemberton across the Big Black River on May the 18th, Sherman turned to me. We were sitting our horses, and he said enthusiastically, just ejaculated, by God, Grant, you've done it. If you don't take Vicksburg, if you don't do anything else, you have executed the most brilliant campaign in history. By God, you've done it. I wish I hadn't sent the letter. I wish you hadn't sent it. And I said, I didn't. And Sherman looked at me. He said, I beg your pardon. I said, I didn't send that letter. I knew, I knew you were concerned. I understood your feelings. And I felt it better for me and for you that I just hold on to the letter. I will send it if you want me to. I still have it. But I haven't sent it. Sherman was most grateful. And we let the matter drop. The other prong, though, that I referenced, there's Sherman and there's Johnston. Joe Johnston got to Jackson, Mississippi, as I recall, May the 13th. And Johnston he's talking out of both sides of his general mouth. He's telling Jefferson Davis, I am too late. The Yankees are already between me and Vicksburg. I am too late. He didn't want to be there to start with, and he couldn't abide Jefferson Davis anyway. Davis didn't have anybody else he could send because he'd made everybody else angry, demoted or moved everybody else. Johnston was the man. But Johnston was also urging Pemberton, come out of the city and let us attack Grant. Because for the first few days that I was on the ground there in Mississippi, the rebels outnumbered us 2-1. There were more than 60,000 rebels in the area, and I had less than 40,000. But Pemberton did not see fit to come out against me, which did not surprise me. And then that window, after about 3 days, that window passed. And we were indeed between Johnston and Vicksburg, Johnston and Jackson, Pemberton and Vicksburg. Johnston then begins telling Pemberton, evacuate Vicksburg, save the army. We can do without the city. Losing the position would not be nearly as devastating as losing an entire army. And Pemberton had 31,000 men. Jefferson Davis, though, his commander-in-chief is telling him hold Vicksburg at all costs to the last man, which calls to mind what I like to add to that. The man who orders hold to the last man is almost never there. So it's easier to say hold it to the last man as long as I'm not going to be the potential for the last man. But Pemberton's commanding officer is saying, get out, save the army. His commander-in-chief is saying, stay there and fight to the last man. Now, a soldier is going to obey his commander-in-chief. So I have some sympathy for Pemberton. He's caught in the middle there. And I understand that, but I wasn't worried about him coming out to give me battle because I knew he's not a combat general. He's an excellent engineer and an excellent administrator, but he's not a combat general. I had no worries about Pemberton. In fact, I would have welcomed Pemberton giving me battle. But we had gotten across the river. I took Port Gibson on the 3rd of May. And then Johnston is coming in to the northwest. I know he's going to be there. And I decided that instead of going, well, I could have gone to my right to the south or to my left to the north. Now, to the south would have been, which was expected of me, to join General Nathaniel Banks to take Port Hudson, which is 100 miles south of Vicksburg. Port Hudson, Louisiana. And capture that. And then Banks was going to join forces with me, and we were both going to, en masse, move to the north and attack Vicksburg. Well, I had asked Banks for 10,000 men, and he diddled and dallied. And finally, he tells me after a delay of several days, which was maddening for me, he says, well, I can only send you 10,000. It's going to be about a month before I can send them to you. And I thought, no, I'm not going to wait. Waiting a month for 10,000 men would empower the rebels far more than the 10,000 men are going to empower me. You know, Khomeini said, time not well used accrues benefits to the enemy he did not earn. And for me to wait a month for 10,000 men, and if indeed, as things often turn out, I might not have even gotten 10,000 men. So I knew I wasn't going to wait for that and give the rebels a chance to dig in even harder. So when I got across the river, yes, I remember my request for 10,000 men that was denied, in essence. And instead of going south, I decided I'm going north and go after Vicksburg without Nathaniel Banks. Now, this may have disturbed Banks because, see, Banks outranked me. Banks would have been in command. So, but I went north. I thought Banks can handle Frank Gardner, who was I graduated with Frank from the academy in the class of 43. And Frank's in command at Port Hudson, which, by the way, never fell until Frank found out that Pemberton had surrendered to me. Banks never took him. But I moved north. And then I went over to the northeast because I can't have a rebel force in Jackson nipping at my hindquarters while I'm facing Vicksburg. And when Joe Johnston is on the field, I am concerned. So in moving to the northwest, we fought the Battle of Raymond, Mississippi, which was a bloody affair. We went in and took Jackson, Mississippi, which wasn't much of a fight, but a sharp little fight there. My son Fred was nearly captured. And I say that in that manner. You know, nearly is one, an adverb is a dangerous word, and nearly is one of those. But Fred, as he told me, he and Charles Dana, who Dana's there to spy on me. Am I drinking? Am I doing what I ought to do? I knew that. And I told my staff, embrace him, make him one of us, which we did. Dana loved us for it. He and Fred, when I moved out of Port Gibson to head toward Raymond, he and Fred found two of the most ancient horses I've ever seen. I laughed when I saw them ride up. Their muzzles were snow white. They were so old. And they'd gotten some tack somewhere. So Fred, who's 12 at this time, and Dana come riding up and caught up with me. And they had gone on into Jackson as we're all moving in. And Fred told me after, Father, we were riding into Jackson And I'm riding down the road and troops are filing past me on both sides, leaving Jackson. And it suddenly occurred to me, they're Confederate troops. And I thought, oh no. But fortunately, he said, my uniform, and I'd given him a little colonel's uniform that was cut to fit him. It was cute. His mother says it's cute, little sword and so forth. He was very proud of it. The men call him the little colonel, very popular young man. But he suddenly finds himself the commanding general's son in the middle of hundreds of Confederate soldiers who are not, by the way, in a very good mood. And Fred said, I think what saved me was my uniform was so muddy that it looked like their butternut uniforms too. So they paid me no mind. He said, I got away from them as best I could. We took Jackson. One anecdote I should like to relate, Sherman came to me and said, you need to see this. He took me to a manufactory that was running mills that were running off tent canvas. And as it's running through the mills, they're stamping at CSA, and all the ladies working it. I came in with Sherman. There was a whole party of staff, and they paid us absolutely no mind. We barely got a glance. And Sherman said, I don't understand this. And it occurred to me, and I told Sherman, they don't know who we are. They can't accept the idea that Yankees are actually in Jackson, Mississippi. They don't know who we are. That's why they're not paying us any mind. So I said, stop them and tell them, take all the fabric that you can carry and leave the building and fire it, which he did, they did, he did. And then we left. We wheeled back to the west to go into Vicksburg and fought the Battle of Champion Hill. Very bloody affair. McClernand let me down, I think, in that battle. But I was not happy with his performance. In fact, he was barely involved at all. McPherson carried the brunt. But we won Champion Hill. And some are saying it may be the most important battle in the war. I don't know. I don't know how much longer the war is going to last, and I won't hazard that kind of a grandiose statement. But we pushed Pemberton back to the Big Black River, which was the last bastion between him, us, and Vicksburg. We pushed him back across the river. And he fell back into Vicksburg. Rain begins to fall, night falls. And I understand he told his aide as they're riding through the rain, I began my military career 30 years ago this day when I entered the United States Military Academy. And now I find myself with that career in disgrace. And they moved back into Vicksburg. Now, it took me a day to get people in place, but on May the 19th, we assaulted the works at Vicksburg. I thought we could take them, and I was mistaken. It became a killing field, and we were not able to not get very close. We washed up against them, but couldn't take them. And by the 22nd of May, the 21st, I had decided we're going to make another charge. Now, key in this, Sherman told me I wasn't going to try. But Sherman told me, let my boys try. Let my Ohio boys try. And what I accepted most from his thinking, of course, I wanted to take Vicksburg. I knew what summertime down south was. I knew how miserable it could be. I did not want to get involved in a siege, and it looked like it was going to be a siege. And if there was a possibility of taking Vicksburg by storm, that was what should be done, even at risk of high casualties. But key to my thinking was when Sherman so emotionally appealed to me, and logically, not just emotionally. He said, let my boys try, because if you don't, Grant, They're going to go the rest of their lives saying, we could have taken them. We could have done it if they just let us try. And I accepted his thinking and ordered the charge. And so on May 22nd, we had the assault on the rebel works there at Vicksburg, and it was a disaster. It was a bloodbath. And after watching enough of that, I said, call them back. Let's stop. They waited till nightfall, and then the dead and wounded, such as could get back to the wounded, could get back to our lines. They got back, and we went into siege. Now, 46 days later, on 44 days later, on July 1st, I had ordered that there's going to be an all-out assault. There were 8 to 12 miles of trenches by now, from north around the Walnut Hills of Vicksburg in a crescent, southeast, then southwest, back to Warrenton, Mississippi, which is a small community south of Vicksburg. 12 miles of trenches. But I had ordered that there's going to be an all-out assault on July the 6th. By now, I've got 71,000 troops. Pemberton's got 31,000. Now, half of my troops, 6 divisions of my troops and 2 in reserve, are facing back to the east toward Jackson, where Joe Johnston is. The other half are facing to the west, in some places 15 feet from the rebel lines. They were so close, they were actually pitching tobacco and coffee over the lines to each other. In fact, they were coming out after dark and meeting and drinking coffee and smoking and talking about what was happening. They were very polite, I understand. They would yell, hold your head down, Yank, put your head down, Reb, got to fire one. And they'd fire a shot. Here comes the commanding officer, and they'd fire a shot. Then when the officer went by, I think many times it was that situation. When the officer goes by, they, okay, Reb, okay, Yank, it's all right. You can stand up now. Military humor is wonderful. But I knew that they couldn't resist. And I had told my men, yell across the lines and tell them, we're coming at you on the 6th. Be prepared. We're coming at you. And they were saying, they were asking, when are you going to come in, Yank? And well, we're going to be there. We're planning to be there on the 4th of July. We're going to have dinner with Pemberton on the 4th of July. And they would yell back, well, you got to catch your rabbit for your dinner before you can have dinner in here. And they were even putting that in the newspaper and so forth, which they were by now printing on wallpaper. And everything was in place on the 1st of July for the 6th of July assault. But then on the 3rd of July, I'm in my tent, and an aide comes in and gives me a message, and he said, General, there's a Reb general out here named John S. Bowen, Major General Bowen, and he wants to see you. And he's saying that General Pemberton really wants to meet with you. Well, John Bowen and I had been neighbors and good friends in St. Louis before the war, when I was in my wilderness days, as I refer to it, trying to make a living scuffling, and ultimately went broke farming. And I knew that Pemberton had sent Bowen for that reason. See, Bowen is significant because Pemberton knew we were friends. And it's even more poignant when you know that Bowen had actually had to get off his sickbed suffering from a case of dysentery that he died of just days later. But he had the runs to the point that he was dying of it. And he got out of his cot and put on his uniform and rode out under the orders of Pemberton to meet with me. So it's of great significance that John Bowen was the messenger. Well, I told my aide I'll not meet with him. because I was going to have no truck with negotiations, and I was not going to meet a man who was not equal in rank to myself. If Pemberton wanted to talk, Pemberton could come out and say, let's talk. So the aide was about to leave, and I said, wait. I had the note. Tell Bowen to tell General Pemberton that I'll meet him at 3 p.m. today where our lines are closest together. And that was McPherson's area, and it was at a place on a little hill there, a knoll with an old oak tree on it. I'll meet him at 3 and we'll talk. But tell him there are no conditions but unconditional. And I sent that note back, wrote that out. At 3 p.m., true to form, here comes Pemberton. He had Lieutenant Colonel Montgomery. I know not why that name sticks with me. I haven't seen him before or since. And John Bowen was there too. And I came out with McPherson, EOC Ord, A.J. Smith, John Logan. Got off my horse. Pemberton gets off his horse. We walked together a bit stiffly, shook hands, and Pemberton said, well, General Grant, what terms have you? First, I've heard of terms. And I said, I have no terms except what I told you in my note. No terms but unconditional surrender. And Pemberton, he clouded up and got a little hot with me. And he said, well, they told me you wanted to meet with me. So see, Bowen is telling me that Pemberton really wants to meet with me. And he's telling Pemberton, Grant really wants to meet with you. Neither one of us had said that, but Bowen's trying to bring us together. And I said, no terms but unconditional. And Pemberton swells up and he said, well, a number of your men are going to die because of this. We can hold out indefinitely. Yeah, the blood will be yours, and such folderol as that. And I said, very well, turned around and walked back to my horse. Well, Pemberton's stalking back to his horse. John Bowen and Seth Williams, another general is there, my aide, they both entreated us. Let us work something out. You fellas sit down on the log yonder and just have a talk. And I said, very well, you may speak and negotiate as you wish. So Pemberton and I sat down on the logs, I recall. You see, I knew that I was not bound by any agreement that they may come to, but perhaps they could come to an agreement. And again, now I'll point out that's a little flexing on my part. It's not, I'm not so much it's unconditional or it's nothing. I've met with Pemberton, and now I'm letting two aides talk things over. So I sat down with Pemberton, lit a cigar, and we very pleasantly passed the time talking about the old days. Well, directly, half hour or so, here comes Seth Williams and McPherson and John Bowen. And Bowen said, we got it worked out. Here's the proposal. Now, what they wanted to do was to have the Confederates march into Vicksburg and with their arms and march out, taking their property with them. And I said, no, we're not going to do that. And so Pemberton, he's got his back up, the cat meow type thing, and because that's what he wanted. And I said, we can't do that. But General, let me think about this, and I'll send you a message no later than 10 o'clock this evening. And Pemberton, of course, he had no choice, but he said, very well. So we both mounted our horses and left. Now, I would say, though, that I suspect that oak tree under which we met is probably going to disappear. Within 24 hours, it was gone. Even the roots had been dug up and pieces of the tree. And I would wager that in the future, there are going to be as many pieces of the surrender tree, as they're calling it, as there are pieces of the true cross. So I went back to headquarters and I did something I hadn't done before and something I'll never do again. I called a staff meeting and I had the most junior to the most senior officer tell me what you think. What would you do? Not being bound by anything you say, what would you do? Well, they all wanted to attack. After I listened to all of that, I said, no, we're not going to do that. I'm going to parole them. That did not sit well with my staff. And as I dismissed them and they dispersed, I resolved I will never do this again. Holding a staff meeting is a colossal waste of time because basically I'm going to do what I think is best. I don't need someone else to tell me what's best. But staff meetings are a waste of time, and they only serve to aggravate the staff when you don't do what they tell you that you should do. Never again. So I sent the message to General Pemberton. Now it's getting 10 o'clock in the evening of July 3rd. I sent General Pemberton the message that you can, if you mean by march out of your camps where your men are entrenched, you can march them out, stack arms where they're camped, and then they can all march back in and hold themselves prisoners to be paroled in the camps that they presently occupy. Officers may keep their sidearm and their personal baggage, and officers, staff members, and artillerymen may keep the animals that they say are theirs. We didn't want their animals. We're having to stretch a bit to feed our own animals. We don't need hundreds of thousands more mules and horses to feed. So march out, stack arms, march back into camp. Officers keep sidearms and personal baggage. Well, Pemberton came back with me late in the night. By now, it's midnight. He dated his letter to me July 3rd. I didn't get it till the wee hours of the morning on the 4th. And he said, your terms are accepted by and large, but I must tell you that the property of the people, of the citizens of Vicksburg, you must guarantee their safety. I don't know the specific wording, but guarantee the property and the safety of that property of the people of Vicksburg, and that officers can take their property with them. Well, I replied to him, first of all, I don't plan to wreak any havoc with the people of Vicksburg and their property, although, and I will not be bound by any restraint of protecting that property. We'll be checking for what's contraband of war, and we'll determine what should be confiscated or destroyed or not. And I hold that decision in my hands, but I won't be restrained by any covenant that I've made with you. The other issue is that officers may take, as I said in my original message, they may take their horse, their sidearms, and their personal baggage, because I knew that property is going to translate into body servants and slaves. And I had told my staff, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation almost to the day 6 months ago. And everywhere that we go, there are no more slaves. You know, when the Federal Army occupies an area, slavery is over. And I wasn't about to have any officer saying, he belongs to me, and take him out. Now, the next day on the 5th, though, McPherson sent me a letter and said, what about these fellas? Are we supposed to enlist these Negroes? Are we supposed to tell them you can't go with your master? Or what am I supposed to do with this, about this issue? And his concern was reasonable. And I replied to him, we can't enlist any Negroes at this time. Don't do that just yet. I had no problems with black troops, but this situation was still forming, and don't tell them that we're going to enlist them just yet. I didn't want possible disappointment to fall over exultation. I need to find out what to do about enlisting Negro troops. Also, don't tell them they can't go with their master. Tell them they don't have to. Because as it was pointed out to me and McPherson, he said a lot of these individuals have been raised together. They're like family. Now, so I told McPherson, tell them they don't have to. But if they want to go with the man they're with, it's okay. Just be sure you know they want to go, because if you leave it up to the Confederate officers, they're all going to say, well, he's my man and he wants to go with me. Don't you? Don't make sure that it's voluntary if they accompany their man that they're serving. And also I told McPherson, it's all right if some of them go back with their masters. It's all right. Because when they get back with other blacks that are in the same position with Confederate officers, they're going to say, Grant, let us go. We're here. I want to be here. But Grant's letting the blacks go. And that would do us, I think, a great deal of good. So I clarified in my note to Pemberton on the 4th. Personal property does not include slaves. I'm not going to be held accountable for what happens to the property of the citizens. And if I don't see flags on your lines by 9 o'clock in the morning, I will consider the truce at an end. I'm going to send word to Admiral Porter to resume firing upon the city. I had asked, in fact, I'd gone out and talked with him during the 4th and said, hold your fire. And I waited. Well, 9 o'clock came and went. All right, Pemberton, if that's what you want, that's what you can have. And 10 o'clock, the flags began to appear, white flags all along the lines. So by 10 o'clock, it was over. Pemberton had surrendered. Then we got into the paperwork of signing paroles, vouching for men, officers signing their own paroles, the wounded getting paroles. So when they left and their officers were already gone, possibly, they would have their paroles. And see, I wanted to parole them for 2 reasons. The first being that Porter had told me, if you want me to take 30,000 men back up north to actually on the James River, Aiken's Landing on the James River is the exchange point for Federals. Vicksburg was the exchange point for Confederates. Well, I'm in Vicksburg, and the Colonel Watts, who was a Confederate exchange agent, was in Vicksburg. Now, for me to wait 3 months to 6 months to have 30,000 men transported up to Aiken's Landing in Virginia, only for them to be paroled and sent back, because we had more Confederates than we had Federal. They had Federal prisoners. So they'd have to be paroled. Well, I can parole them here, and I don't have to wait while Porter takes them up. I don't have to go into garrison duty for several months. I got a war to win, and I don't want to stay here. I've got to move. So I wanted to parole them for that reason, but I also wanted to parole them because I knew most of them lived in the region where we were. And I felt that once they got home and they had that piece of paper, see, they got the parole form. And when they go back home, they can hold up that parole form and say, I've done my part. I was at Vicksburg. I've got the parole. I'm staying right here until the Confederate government comes to me and says, you've been exchanged. You can come back to the ranks, because they could do that honorably. And I thought they'll stay home. I hope that works. Now, Pemberton, as we're waiting for them to get all their parole signed, the men are starting to desert. Now, there were several hundred who said, we're not signing a parole. Pemberton tells me, I said, tell them you're going to be put on a prison ship out in the river and you're going to stay there until I see fit to send you north. See, they didn't want to sign the parole because they thought, I don't want to be paroled. I'm out of this war. A lot of them came to our lines and said, let us go. We want to go to New York City and work up there until the war is over. Then we'll come back. They were deserting by the score. Pemberton wanted to hold them all in the prison camp till they were paroled. He wanted me to arm some of his men as sentries. I said, no. Then he comes back and says, arm some of your men as sentries. I said, no, because you see, I was wanting them to desert and leave and go home. But on the 11th, they start marching out to Edward Station to get on the cars to go to Jackson and be paroled and go wherever their several homes were. General Halleck telegraphed me, wait, don't parole them, don't send them away, because since we're not officially exchanging, it may be considered as an illegal parole or exchange, and they'll consider it as invalid, and they'll start fighting us again. And I telegraphed back, they're already gone. Now, they were leaving as I did so, but I said, they're already gone. And that was the end of the Confederates being paroled and sending an entire army out without having to wait. Now, I'm ready to move. And I propose for the third time, let us move to Mobile, Alabama, and take Mobile Bay, take the distribution city that is Mobile. I'd done that after Donelson. I'd done it after Shiloh. And for the third time, I'm advocating to Halleck, let us take Mobile. We can go through the South. They can't get enough people in front of us to stop us. And we'll split the Confederacy yet again asunder. The western part of the river, the country has fallen away as if an earthquake took it away. Now we can swing to the southeast, go to Mobile, Alabama, and slice it yet again. And yet again, Halleck rebuffed me and said, no, we're not going to do that. You're going to stay in place. And he began parsing out my troops. I sent the Ninth Corps back to Burnside, and I sent thousands down to Banks in New Orleans. I lost so many men in the distribution that I became fearful for the first time. Really, I was in a defensive position. If there were enough rebels in the area in central Mississippi that if they'd all gotten together, they could have really given us a potential very serious problem. And I couldn't. I'm stuck. I'm truly stuck in a purgatory of inactivity. And I am waiting and waiting and waiting.
General Grant, we are going to pick up this conversation and find out what you're waiting for in our next segment.
Yes, so.
It has been a pleasure to listen to you recount your stories for us today.
Well, it's good to reflect. Sometimes painful when I think about things that I could have done differently, or perhaps things I should not have done that cost lives. But I did the best I could at the moment by the light I had to see to walk my path.
So, thank you very much, General Grant. I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. On behalf of General Grant, as portrayed by Curt Fields, thanks for being with us today. We'll be back with more. Until then, we'll see you online and on the battlefield.